committee. My name is Abdurrahman Allah and I'm an ecologist working for Earth Think. And I'm here today to report to you about a specific organism that we need to ensure its survival to benefit an ecosystem. Before we begin, let me give you a small indication about polar bears. Polar bears inhabit Arctic sea ice, water, islands, and continental coastlines. Polar bears also prefer sea ice habitat with leaves and pollinaceous. Next to continental coastlines or islands, polar bears hunt seals in the leads using sea ice as a platform. And now let's move to the description of the ecosystem with some examples. So what is an ecosystem? The ecosystem is the structural and functional unit of ecology where the living organisms interact with each other and the surrounding environment. In other words, an ecosystem is a chain of interaction between organisms and their environment. It consists of abiotic components like soil, water, and air, and biotic components like flora and fauna. An ecosystem can be as large as a desert or as small as a tree. And also the major parts of an ecosystem is water, temperature, plants, animals, air, light, and soil. Now that we have discussed about the ecosystem, let's move on to the interactions between the organism species I chose and its abiotic and biotic components. So as I said in the beginning of the video, my organism is a polar bear. So sunlight, air, soil, rock, minerals, water, etc. are all biotic factors, and air also interacts with plants, helping them to grow by providing a source of carbon, CO2, and other nutrients. In general, abiotic factors like rock, soil, and water interact with biotic factors in the form of providing nutrients. Sunlight, minerals, nutrients are all biotic factors. Why? I could say because polar bear is a part of this cycle and it is a living being, and living beings are all biotic. And also keep in mind that rocks, soil are all abiotic. Now let's move on to the structure of the ecosystem. The structure of an ecosystem is characterized by the organization of both biotic and abiotic components. This includes the distribution of energy in our environment. It also includes the climatic conditions prevailing in the particular environment. The structure of an ecosystem can be split into two main components, namely biotic components and abiotic components. The biotic and abiotic components are interrelated in an ecosystem. It is an open system where the energy and the components can flow throughout the boundaries. So let's differentiate between biotic components and abiotic components. Biotic components are the components which refer to all life in an ecosystem based on nutrition. Biotic components can be characterized in autotrophs, heterotrophs, and saprotrophs or decomposers. For abiotic components, they are the non-living component of an ecosystem. It includes air, water, soil, minerals, sunlight, temperature, nutrients, wind, altitude, etc. And now I'm gonna explain how carrying capacity in your ecosystem will support the preservation of the species population. And I'm also gonna give an example of how carrying capacity can be exceeded to decrease the population of my species. And what is the danger to the species and why? My species is a polar bear, and as I told before, so in a population at its carrying capacity, there are so many organisms of that species as the habitat can support. The carrying capacity depends on biotic and abiotic factors. In these factors, it improves the carrying capacity and it increases. If the factors become less plentiful, the carrying capacity drops. When the number of birth equals the number of death, the population is at the carrying capacity. And for that habitat, if resources are being used faster than they are being replenished, then the species has exceeded its carrying capacity. And if this occurs, the population will then decrease in size. And now we are gonna go and explain the food web and the food chain of a polar bear, and also we are gonna offer solutions to ensure the preservation of our population. So let's begin. A food chain is a diagram showing the linear transfer of energy between different organisms. In other words, food chains show what eats in a particular ecosystem. The food is the energy transferred. Food webs are similar, but they show how many food chains in an ecosystem relate to each other. Food chains and food webs always start with producers, organisms that make their own energy. Usually these are green plants. Next come the herbivores, also known as primary consumers. These are the ones which eat the producers. Next, secondary consumers eat the primary consumers, and finally, tertiary consumers are the top predators and eat secondary and primary consumers. These are very important and keep the ecosystem in balance. What you're looking at right now is a diagram of the players in a food chain. To understand the food chain of a polar bear, we need to know some things about polar bears. Polar bears live on the sea ice of the Arctic, the most northern region of the globe. They do not live in Antarctica as some may think. Polar bears are excellent swimmers and have thick layers of fat fur to keep them warm in a sub-climate. Although cuddly polar bears are fierce predators, as we will learn in this food chain. Polar bears are tertiary consumers, meaning they eat other secondary and primary consumers. Let's talk about and look at the organisms that provide energy for polar bears. The polar bear's first choice of food is the delicious ringed and bearded seals. Seals in general have thick layers of fat and rich calories. Polar bears need also to keep themselves warm. As you can see on screen now, a ringed seal pup navigates the ice. If the seals are unavailable, polar bears will go after larger prey such as beluga, whales, and even baby walruses. In desperate situations, though, they will eat just about anything including reindeer, fish, and birds. If we continue with our food chain after seals, the secondary consumer, we get to the primary consumer, which are the food for the seals. Seals eat fish like the Arctic cod as well as microscopic organisms such as zooplankton. Zooplankton are primary consumers and eat tiny producers called phytoplankton. You can remember the difference between these two organisms because zoo contains animals. So the zooplankton are the animals and the phytoplankton are the plants. Phytoplankton are very important for the entire ocean ecosystem. There are billions of phytoplankton in the oceans that make up the base of all food chains and food webs. Since polar bears are tertiary consumers, they are at the top of the food web. This makes them a keystone species. Keystone species are tertiary consumers that help keep the food web in a balance. There may be few of them in an ecosystem, but they control the population of the primary and secondary consumers. Without keystone species, primary consumers grow out of control, eating all the producers. Without producers as an energy source for the food chain, the entire ecosystem will collapse. Currently, polar bears are in danger of becoming extinct. Global warming or a rise in a global temperature due to the carbon dioxide production is melting the sea ice polar bears live on. As you can see on screen now, sea ice in the Arctic Ocean off the coast of Russia is diminishing. Polar bears are also used to the frigid temperatures they live in and do not survive well in the warmer conditions. To protect polar bears, we must reduce carbon dioxide emissions to halve global warming. One way to do this is reducing the use of cars, fuels, carpooling, etc. Using public transportation or using hybrid electric cars. Recycling and reducing electricity use or using solar power to reduce carbon dioxide production. And finally, let's move on to a summary of the polar bear and its importance to its ecosystem. So, in a summary, a food chain is a linear transfer of energy through different organisms. Many food chains put together are called a food web. The food web always begins with producers. Producers in the Arctic oceans are phytoplankton but typically are just considered plants. Primary consumers like zooplankton and small fish eat the phytoplankton. Seals are secondary consumers and eat the fish and zooplankton. Polar bears are the keystone species, tertiary consumers that help keep the food web in a balance. And tertiary consumers top of the food chain in the Arctic ecosystem. They eat mainly seals, but sometimes whales and baby walruses. Since polar bears are a keystone species, they keep the ecosystem in a balance. However, they are in danger of the extinction due to the global warming or the rise in global temperatures. Due to the carbon dioxide production, which is melting the sea ice polar bears live on. And finally, that I have reached the end, I want to say that I'm 100% sure that you have understood everything about the importance of polar bears to their ecosystem, and I thank you very much for listening and see you soon.